The first rays of dawn painted the sky in a deep blue, tinged with orange hues, as Imam Hassan rose to lead the Fajr prayer in the small mosque of Paterson, New Jersey. He had performed this daily ritual thousands of times, his deep and peaceful voice echoing under the dome, carrying the faithful into an almost celestial serenity. But that morning, as the worshippers bowed for sujood, an invisible tension settled in the air. A dull thud rang out, a scream, a silhouette rushed toward the imam, cutting through the row of prostrated worshippers. Then, an impact, violent, brutal. Hassan staggered forward under the force of the blow, his breath knocked out of him. A shiver ran through the congregation as some worshippers quickly stood up, some shouting in shock, others running to subdue the assailant. 2 men pinned him to the ground, his body twisted with rage and pain. The imam, panting, instinctively clutched his chest where the blow had struck. But it wasn't the physical pain that paralyzed him. It was what he had just seen in his attacker's eyes. Immense sorrow, devouring distress. The man was quickly restrained and taken outside to wait for the police. Some of the worshippers, furious, hurled insults at him, demanding retribution. "We must press charges," shouted an elderly man, his face hardened by anger. "This is an act of hate," added another. But Hassan, still in shock, slowly got to his feet. He observed the man, an American in his 50s, his features drawn with grief. His breathing was erratic, and his eyes were flooded with tears of rage. "Why?" the imam asked in a trembling voice. The man stared at him, his fists clenched, and murmured in a broken tone, "Your people killed my son." The imam felt his heart tighten. He understood immediately. This was not just an attack, but the expression of uncontrollable suffering. A choice lay before him. Should he respond to hatred with the justice of men, or should he seek to understand what had led this man to such a desperate act? Later, as he tended to his aching chest, the imam confided in his mentor, Sheikh Abdullah. The old man listened attentively, nodding slowly before speaking. "There are 2 forms of justice, my brother. That of the courts, and that of the heart. Which one do you think Allah prefers?" Hassan closed his eyes. He knew the answer. The man who had attacked him was not a criminal but a devastated father. "Then what should I do?" he asked. The elderly man smiled gently. "Go to him. Listen to him." Imam Hassan felt his heart beating faster as he walked through the cold hallways of the police station. The smell of disinfectant and old paper filled the air, while officers moved back and forth, indifferent to his presence. He had been faced with a difficult choice, to stand before his attacker, the man who had struck him, in the middle of prayer, or to turn the page without seeking to understand. But Hassan knew that his duty was not only to guide with words but also with action. He had to see this exchange through, even if the pain was still fresh. When he entered the small interrogation room, he found a man slumped in a metal chair, his wrists handcuffed to the table. Ethan Carter. His gaze was empty, his features hollowed by fatigue and anxiety. The dark circles under his eyes cast deep shadows on his pale skin. A police officer closed the door behind the imam. The atmosphere was heavy. The man didn't even lift his head. He seemed broken, like a ship that had weathered too many storms. Hassan slowly pulled out the chair across from him and sat down in silence. He didn't yet know what words to use, but he knew he had to start by listening. Ethan eventually raised his eyes. He scrutinized the imam's face as if trying to understand why this man, whom he had attacked, had come to see him. "Why are you here?" he asked in a rough, weary voice. The imam clasped his hands on the table and gazed at him with kindness. "Because I want to understand." A heavy silence settled, as if the air had thickened around them. Ethan let out a bitter, hollow laugh and looked away. "Understand what?" "That I lost my son because of one of yours. That you sit here like a good man while I'm treated like a criminal." His voice broke in a mixture of anger and sadness. His clenched fingers trembled slightly on the metal table. Hassan made no sudden movements. He simply placed a gaze full of compassion on Ethan. "Tell me your story." Ethan let out a shaky sigh. For a few seconds, he struggled with his emotions, torn between rage and collapse. Then, finally, he gave in. His voice cracked as he spoke of his son, Michael, a 19-year-old, passionate about football, an engineering student at university. A beloved, admired son, full of life. Then came the fateful night. An accident. A driver of Palestinian origin, a young man of 20, had just left work. He was neither drunk nor on drugs, but he had run a red light while trying to avoid another car. His vehicle had crashed into Michael's. The impact had been fatal. Ethan recounted the phone call in the middle of the night, the frantic race to the hospital, the chilling announcement from the doctor. My son was dead before I even got there. His voice was now just a whisper. He ran a hand over his face, his shoulders shaking with barely contained sobs. Hassan felt a painful warmth spread through his own heart. He knew this pain, the pain of losing a loved one. He couldn't erase it, but he could embrace it. I'm sorry. Ethan lifted his head, his eyes burning with both anger and tears. Sorry. He laughed, but it was a hollow, painful laugh. Sorry won't bring my son back. Sorry won't fix my broken heart. Hassan slowly nodded. No, it won't bring him back. Ethan clenched his fists on the table. Then tell me, Imam, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live with this? The Imam took a deep breath before responding, with a gentleness that contrasted with his interlocutor's agitation. You must learn to heal. A silence followed. Ethan seemed taken aback, as if he had expected to hear apologies, guilt, maybe even justification. But not that. Heal, he repeated bitterly. I don't want to heal. I want him back. I want to hear his voice again. I want to tell him I'm proud of him. Do you understand that? Ethan's voice rose, trembling. Hassan leaned slightly forward, his features filled with compassion. Yes, I understand. Ethan clenched his jaw. No, you don't understand. You can't understand. The Imam didn't flinch. I lost my brother years ago. Ethan's anger seemed to waver. He was killed in an attack. A man filled with hate decided that his anger was worth more than the lives of innocents. The man across from him remained silent. I know this pain, Ethan. This rage that eats away at you. That feeling of injustice, that void that never fills. I could have let hatred consume me too, but I assure you of one thing, it will bring you nothing. It will devour you. Ethan ran a hand over his face, looking away. So what? I'm supposed to forgive. Is that your miraculous solution? Hassan slowly shook his head. No, not right away, not now, but maybe one day, you'll find another way to live with your pain, without letting it consume you. Ethan seemed to absorb these words. He crossed his arms, staring at an invisible point on the table. And what if I don't want to? What if I can't? Hassan smiled gently. Then I'll be here to help you try. For the first time, Ethan's expression changed. There was no longer only anger and pain. There was something else, more fragile, more subtle. A beginning of openness. The police officer behind the observation glass furrowed his brow, incredulous. He never would have thought he'd see an imam extending his hand to the man who had attacked him. Ethan Carter, however, slowly lowered his head. He wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet, but for the first time since his son's death, he was no longer alone in his grief. And maybe that was the first step. The Muslim community was divided upon learning of the imam's decision to forgive and help Ethan. Some supported him, others called him idealistic, naive. But Hassan persevered. He encouraged dialogue between Ethan and the community, hoping that this man's pain would turn into understanding rather than resentment. One day, Hassan invited Ethan to attend an interfaith gathering. It was a challenge. Ethan hesitated, then accepted. When he entered the mosque, the stairs were heavy, but he listened. He heard the stories of Muslims who had also lost loved ones, accounts of suffering and forgiveness. Little by little, his posture changed. His gaze softened. He began to understand that pain was not exclusive to one community. One evening, after an especially moving discussion, Ethan stood up and spoke. I have realized that I cannot bring justice to my son by attacking innocent people. I came here with hatred, and today, I want to learn to live with my pain without letting it consume me. A silence settled over the room. Imam Hassan slowly approached and, in front of everyone, extended his hand to Ethan. The man hesitated, then shook it. That was the true ordeal, to forgive, and to accept being forgiven. Months passed. Ethan Carter became a passionate advocate for interfaith dialogue. He worked with the mosque to promote tolerance. One morning, before prayer, a worshipper whispered to Hassan, "Look, Ethan is here." Hassan turned his head. In a corner, Ethan Carter stood, watching the prayer in silence. He had not converted, but he was there, at peace. The imam then knew that his journey was complete. He had transformed hatred into hope.